Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
And this is the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast. Today, our guest is Diane King, a civil rights attorney who has had huge cases that make national news, but who's very important to me because in a very tough time in my life, when I was a reporter in Denver, Colorado, pushing for better coverage of women and minorities, I had a real boss hole who tried to thwart my career. And Diane was part of my support system and in her own life was doing very huge and dramatic changes at that same time. And those are certainly part of this story. But for me, the pivotal moment came when I just was so angry at what had been done to me. And I asked her what my options were. And she said this line, which has resonated for so long, which is, success is the best revenge. So you can sue, but if you've got a case that may or may not win, success means you win. I never forgot it. I never forgot you, Diane. You're my hero. You've been in my books. I know a lot of people have counted on you to right the wrongs of the world. So welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. I don't feel worthy, but thank you.
Well, you are totally worthy. And where I want people to get to know you is really where you were in that time, because you took an enormous career risk to bet on yourself while you were pregnant. So tell how you wound up doing this and what all happened.
Well, sometimes I look back and wonder, but I had been working for a law firm and I loved it. I had switched from a big firm to a smaller firm that did civil rights work, but I was working 24/7. And I became pregnant and decided that I wanted to have a little bit more control over my life. And I wanted to maybe spend some time with my kid as well as practicing law. And so decided to start my own firm, which was one of the scariest things I've ever done. And the way I talked myself into it was just to say, if it doesn't work, I'll go get a regular job, but I've got to try this. And luckily it worked with a lot of hard work.
But what a risky time to make that call.
It was a risky time because you feel really vulnerable when you're pregnant, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. And if it didn't work out, I just, like I said, stay home with my kid for a while and go get a regular job, but at least know that I tried.
And before you were in that law firm, which that law firm that you started, that you mentioned was an impressive firm. I remember that. But before that, you were in one of the major Colorado law firms, which was a real grind and it wasn't your passion. And how did you make the decision that you had to go and chase the thing that you loved?
It took me a little while. I've been kind of a slow learner in some of this, but the first thing I did when I started at the big firm was go get an ACLU case. That was kind of a clue that maybe the big firm wasn't my passion. And then I finally decided to leave the big firm, and a couple of things happened. One is that I was the new lawyer in the employment law section of the firm and the only woman. And I never had a trial. I had very little experience. And there was an ugly, ugly sexual harassment case that came into the firm. And the client, the owner of the business, wanted me as their lawyer. And I realized that was only because of my gender, that basically he was asking me to use that in his favor. And I thought to myself, you know what? I would much rather be suing you than representing you. So that's number one. And number two, at the same time, my law firm had a layoff and they let go 13 associates, 11 of whom were women. And they were okay on women, but they weren't great. And so we had an associates meeting and I raised my hand to ask about it. I said, did you guys consider that the most people that you're letting go are women? And the partner said to me, I'm going to assume that's a rhetorical question and I'm not going to answer it. And that was my last straw.
Wow.
That's when I decided to leave.
Wow, that is powerful. So in civil rights law, you've been able to do things that have made a difference into people's lives. What are some of the more gratifying things you've been able to accomplish?
I think just helping people, helping women know their value, and not necessarily um, having great wins, although I've had some of those and I'm very, very proud of those. But just working with people to say, listen, you're better than this. You don't have to be treated like this. Stand up for yourself, and really empowering them through the process. I think that's probably the most gratifying.
Michelle, I'm sure you've seen people in time that have had cases worth pushing, but it's always so risky. What are your thoughts about people pushing it, and then get what Diane says about that?
I think this is such an important point because, I mean, if I'm speaking my own experience, but also what I see from a lot of my female colleagues in corporate is there's so much, you don't even know what to do and you feel like you're being unreasonable. So something happens where you feel like, you've been discriminated against or harassed. And the first step is whether or not do I go to HR? And I know I've certainly gone to HR, and I know that I have certainly got the, Michelle, you sure you want to do anything with this? Particularly from women that were in HR, because the odds may not, depending on the culture of the company, the odds may not be in your favor. Do you really want to do this? And so all of a sudden, you feel just stuck. So I'm really curious on, before it ever, what should go to an attorney and what means it's time to take legal action, because there's a lot of us that have been in this place and we end up doing nothing. And then we live with that regret because we know we could have paved a way for somebody else behind us to make it better.
That's a really terrific question. And I think the answer is that the really smart women come early to know what their rights are and to see if it's enough to pursue something and to weigh the pros and cons, because it's not just a legal decision, it is a career decision, it's a personal decision. And my advice is, if you like your job, you kind of hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Cover yourself, keep documents, keep notes. And if you're at the edge of your rope and you really don't think you'll stay, always complain to HR, do it in writing. Don't necessarily expect that they're going to do the right thing. In fact, my experience is they usually don't do the right thing.
Really?
Then you're covered, then you've given them a chance. HR is there for the company to cover the company's liability. They're not there for you.
And I think that is the bad information as employees that we think. We think that they're there for the team and the people. And I think just that one nugget is very empowering for employees. They are not there for you.
They're not. And that's why it's so important that you know your rights from an outside source, because they'll always say it's not enough. Just work with the culture. And sometimes they do these independent investigations themselves.
Right.
They never find for the employee. They're really not independent. And so you just have to know that and protect yourself.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was hoping we could get here, is kind of a primer on what people need to know to protect themselves. Like, what advice do you give all women and all people of any protected class that they should do for themselves as they go along with their work, knowing what's right, what's legal, and then how to document?
Yeah, that's so important. And it's something that as a society we still struggle with. When I was talking to my daughter and her high school friend last night, they're both 22, I asked them how much education they had received in the workplace since they had been working about their rights as women. And they said almost none, which is unfortunate. But obviously, my daughter hanging out in my workplace and listening to me talk is pretty sophisticated about being able to spot these issues. And really, that's the first step, is spotting it. And then next, you have to figure out, once you spotted it, what to do about it. But a lot of people don't even spot it for a long time.
What do they need to spot?
They need to spot when they're being treated differently, when they're being discriminated against. And it can be subtle. It can be that you're not given the same jobs as the guys, that you're not included in the happy hours or the lunches, that you're not invited on the golf outings with the clients, that sort of thing. Or it can be where you miss a promotion and the person that got it is far less qualified, but happens to be a white male. So it runs the gamut depending on what kind of business you're in. Obviously the most severe is being forced to have sex with your boss in order to keep your job.
Does that still happen?
Oh my gosh, yes. I've got the most horrible case right now where single mom, 3 kids, and she put up with that for years, besides the fact that she was incredibly competent and basically running the company. So yes, it still happens, and it happens a lot.
I'm surprised to hear that this is still happening because truly decades ago, it was not uncommon for a boss to say to a woman, if you want a promotion, on your knees, you're quid pro quo, you're not going anywhere. But you would think they would know what a landmine that is and that would have completely stopped.
That's the beauty of Me Too, is it's really educated everybody that it hasn't stopped. It's still really an issue, and we still need to be on guard about it and keep educating the workforce. And with Me Too, we learned that a lot of the people that were the offenders did know better. They're educated, bright men that they knew this was wrong, but they knew that they had the power to get away with it too, at least for years.
So do you see it as much as you used to see it?
I see it a lot. Probably slightly less, but it's still much more common than you would think, than most people think.
Michelle, is that shocking to you?
It is. I think I'm curious about a couple of things. One is, do you tend to have younger women push back and seek advice? I'm wondering if generationally we're seeing an improvement in terms of people speaking out, because I know with my generation, there was too much fear to speak out. I have a few cases I know where somebody did, but for the most part, they didn't. And the ones that did, maybe they won a lawsuit and they disappeared.
I think it's better, and I think that more women know that it's wrong and seek advice about it. And I think younger women are more tuned into that and less willing to accept it. But it still happens more than people think it does. I remember with Me Too, I went to lunch with a really good friend of mine who's a very successful male trial attorney and a really good guy. And he asked me, he said, Diane, does this still really happen? And I said, yeah, it still happens all the time. And he said, I'm not sure I believe that. And that was like the big disagreement that we'd had over time. And like a couple months later, he called me and he apologized. And he said, I was talking to my wife and she confirmed what you said. And I just didn't realize that this was still happening to women. And I said, you were the good guy, so you wouldn't. But yes, it still happens.
Well, how do women find support through something like this? Because I'm thinking about, okay, so you have something happen. You are afraid to pursue it or bring it up. You maybe, like I gave an example with me, you maybe confront your HR department, and then you're kind of on this island. So what should a woman do that finds herself in this situation? Like, what would be the first 2 or 3 steps to empower herself where she's just not constantly standing there in that victim mode, where she can regain some of that power?
There are a couple things she can do. And like I said, some women come early to a lawyer, which is a pretty sophisticated thing to do, or they find themselves getting physically ill because this is really very detrimental both to your mental health and your physical health. And they go to their doctor and say, I'm not sleeping, I'm depressed, I don't know what to do. And the doctor says, go to therapy and get a lawyer. I can't tell you how many doctors refer their patients to lawyers. It's kind of surprising.
How much of the employment law now is you've got different protected classes? So who all needs to be paying attention to right now? Where would you have claims for rights?
Anybody that's not an older white guy basically needs to know what their rights are. If they're a woman, if they're a person of color, if they're a different religion than the majority, if they're disabled, if they're not straight. I mean, there are lots of protected categories.
And then how have the laws changed? Because hasn't it made it harder to get any sort of judgment?
It's not harder. I mean, the laws have gotten progressively better, and juries are pretty astute these days and pretty sophisticated. But we have some conservative judges that don't let these cases get to juries. So I think right now that's a big hurdle.
And when we get to anybody who's got something, you say get the advice from the lawyer, but you've also got strategies for how people can document things as they're happening. So what do we do if we want to document?
Just keep notes and keep copies of things that are helpful. When you get fired, usually it's unexpected and they turn your computer off and lead you out the door, and you don't have a chance to go back and get the things that would have been helpful. So if you think you're being discriminated against, keep hard copies of things. Let me start over again, that one. You should be keeping documentation, so keeping notes, keeping copies of documents so that if you're terminated on the spot and you can't get back to your computer, you have hard copies of things. A lot of people record conversations. You have to be careful about that, and you have to know what the law is in your particular state, and you have to know what the law is in the state of the person that you're recording. But recordings can be very powerful evidence as well.
I didn't realize. So that if you are allowed, like in Colorado, it's one party consent, so you could record me. But if in Florida it's not, and you record me, then is it a crime or is it just inadmissible?
It could be a crime. So I think Florida is one of those states like California and Illinois where it's two-party consent. And depending on the state, it could be a misdemeanor or a felony.
Wow. So what's the best case of documentation you've ever seen anybody have?
I'm working on a case right now where the client was the only woman in a non-traditional job for like 6 years. And she was afraid to complain because she was told that if she did complain, that she would be the one that would be out. But she kept meticulous records for 6 years of every time a guy said something nasty and inappropriate to her, when they called her a bitch, when they excluded her from the lunchtime or after work activities. She kept a detailed record of all of that.
Yeah, I think one lawyer told me once that there's a lot of power in the thank you note. Was that you or was that someone else? That said, if somebody pays you a compliment at work, who's your superior, you send a thank you note via email saying, thank you so much for saying blah, blah, blah. So it's like throwing the documentation back into them.
That could have been me. I mean, if you're complaining about something, put it in writing. If you just had a major accomplishment, put it in writing somehow. Find a way to document that.
So that makes that trail good. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, a lot of times when you complain to HR, if it's not in writing, it disappears. It never happened.
Boy, I just didn't realize that they were so far on the other side. But of course, I guess that makes sense. You just think that if the lesson is everybody says, I'm going to go to HR, you think that means that's your resource. But no. You know, what I've always found interesting in the people who do fight back is even if they win, they're the ones that always have to leave.
Always. Always.
So what's that about?
That's still the case. And, a lot of times they want to leave because they're really burned out on the culture. They want to, and I've encouraged really talented women, go start your own business. Go get your own piece of the pie like you did. So they've done that. But if they want to stay in the same industry, it is really hard. I think Michelle had an opinion about that.
Yeah. Like I say, what I see is you're asked to leave. You're quietly dismissed.
I mean, even if you win.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you win.
But I don't understand this. And the perpetrator stays employed?
Mm-hmm.
I used to ask for the perpetrator to be fired, and the companies would say, no, you're not going to tell us what to do. But if I got a good result, then the perpetrator would be asked to leave. Although a lot of times they're asked to leave quietly, and they get to resign and go do it someplace else.
Do you ever have it where they're really apologetic and you think that they truly didn't know better?
Rarely. Companies are too afraid to be apologetic. I think that's short-sighted. I think if a woman came to HR and felt like she was listened to and the issue was fixed and there was an apology, she probably wouldn't come to me. But I don't think that happens right now.
I remember earlier in my career, it didn't matter if you were talking to a customer, a colleague. There were these unwritten rules about do not apologize because it admits guilt. Like you would be trained to do not apologize.
Doesn't that sometimes make the case more likely to happen?
Well, it's just, I think now I don't necessarily see that anymore, but if I go back in time, that was standard. There was this fear of anything could be put back on me, the company. And so you were just taught not to.
There's a way to apologize that doesn't do that, but most people don't use that. The most effective defense lawyer I ever saw was somebody who, in a mediation, he got a chance to talk to my 3 clients who had been horribly treated in the workplace. And he said, I'm really sorry if this happened to you. It shouldn't have ever happened to you. We try to make sure this doesn't happen. And, I've had bad experiences in my life that are similar, and I know how bad it feels. And so I'm really sorry. And they were practically ready to give away their case for nothing once he did that.
Right. And the operative word, if this happened to you.
So he didn't admit liability for the company, but he showed empathy for my clients, and they loved it. They just really, really felt much better having somebody from the company side empathize with them.
Yeah, I just saw something yesterday. They interviewed, this is not employment law, but it is this concept. They interviewed a woman who was a pet sitter, and she got mauled almost to death. Oh, right. Okay. By 2 dogs when they hadn't been crated like they were supposed to. The owner let them out, and the dogs tried to kill her, and they literally ate her face off of her, and she had 800 bites on her, and she looks horrific, and the people have not apologized. And all I could think of is, I know you're not apologizing because you're scared you're going to get sued, but you're going to get sued. So don't you think that just being a decent human being counts for something? I mean, are we at that point? If those were your clients that had the dogs, would you say don't apologize?
I wouldn't. I would try to, send flowers and be supportive in any way possible. So dissecting it from a lawyer's perspective, they're liable, right? So whether or not they admit it, they're liable, but the damages are another issue. And if they're human beings and kind and sympathetic, then I think that really helps them both legally with their damages and just morally.
So with some of these employment ones, I think that would be true too. So, you're talking to Piper yesterday, your daughter. So how do you mentor her on what to watch for and what she should be doing to protect her career and knowing when to speak up?
That's a good question. When she was little, I used to point out things that I thought were discriminatory all the time. And at one point in time, because I wanted her to be aware and protect herself, and at one point in time, she asked me to stop doing that. And so I did. And then we were on vacation, and we walked into this little gift store, and they had all of these nasty little shot glasses with women's breasts on them. And she looked at that, and she was horrified, and she turned and she looked at me. And so I knew that she had already figured out how to spot that. So she sees it, and she calls me and asks me about it. What do I do? This is what's happening. And she's not anxious to sue. She just wants to be successful, but she doesn't want to be taken advantage of.
What percentage of the people who come to you feeling aggrieved actually have cases that you can take to court and win?
I only see people that I think have cases. And so I only take a few cases, and then I don't litigate most of those. So I try to be really selective. But a lot of people have cases where they really have been discriminated against, but it would be hard to prove in court because of what is required as far as evidentiary standards.
So what is required?
You have to have evidence that is not subtle, essentially, that where a jury would believe that you were discriminated against.
And what defines a hostile work environment now?
A hostile work environment, that's a good question, because you can have a hostile work environment that's not illegal. You can have a boss hole that's nasty to everybody, and that's not illegal. But if the boss hole focuses on women and is nastier to women or nastier to minorities, then that's illegal.
But what about naked calendars? Do those still go up?
They don't. Well, they still go up, but they usually come down. That's the piece of things that people seem to have understood. No naked calendars.
Okay.
Do you find that it's where do you see the biggest opportunity in terms of company culture? Is it with these larger corporations or these smaller companies? Because I think about, I've worked for some big brands, and there's a lot of education that I have gone through sponsored and hosted by these large companies in terms of what's acceptable, what's not. So I wonder if you see if you see more opportunity for education to happen in these smaller or medium-sized companies.
I think that some of the big companies are really sophisticated about it. And so that's terrific. I think it's not just education though. It's walking the talk, and it's looking at their C-suite and seeing who's in the C-suite. And if it's not diverse, you can do all the education you want, but the message sent is we don't truly value it because we don't include it in our culture at the top.
We believe in it, we aren't doing it. And certainly, I think that many of the women that are listening to this, or frankly, minorities that are listening to this, relate to that statement a lot. So what does it take? I mean, what is it that we can do to help drive change? Or is it just, are we powerless in this situation?
We have so much power and we don't even know it, and we don't utilize it well enough for sure. But I think first, companies need to understand that it's not enough to let us in. They have to let us up, and they have to be invested in that. So it's not enough to hire women and minorities and say, okay, we got them. They have to be able to be successful, and that's not happening. And as women, the thing we need to do is we need to understand the special powers that we have and value ourselves appropriately.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
For women, a lot of cultures are missing the female perspective, and it's important. And for instance, if you're selling something and some of your buyers are women, it's really important that you understand what's important to women, and men don't typically. So I think we need to understand that we could contribute a lot that would be valuable. I also think that we as women need to use our buying power appropriately. I went to look for a new car, and I looked at some of the dealerships, and they didn't have any women in sales. So I'm not going to buy a new car from a company that has 20 salespeople with no women.
Well, do you tell them?
I do tell them. I told my orthopedist that I really thought he was great, but that I wouldn't be back until they had a female doctor. They have 40 doctors, and not one of them is a woman.
Wow. What'd they say?
I understand. And they still don't have any women, but I haven't been back.
Back to the point of, you can say it, but what are you doing?
What are you doing?
I think it's a great point. Just the power of, while sometimes we may not have the courage to use our voice, there's other ways that we can make a statement, and how we spend, where we spend is a great tactic.
Now, what about people who feel aggrieved when they're in these other protected classes? Old people, based on race, gays, the LGBTQ community, what rights do they have?
They have the same rights to not be discriminated against. They vary a little bit state to state, but they can file a charge of discrimination at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They don't need a lawyer for that. We have a state agency where you can file a charge as well, and our state statute is a little more broad. So it includes more categories of discrimination that are protected.
And the EEOC, so they do the preliminary right to sue, correct? Investigation?
In theory, they're supposed to do an investigation. We're required, it's called administrative exhaustion. We're required to file a charge within a certain period of time, or our clients are required to. And then after a certain period of time, we're allowed to request the right to sue. The EEOC has been underfunded for years and years and years and years. So they're really slow these days.
So do you have to wait for them?
You have to wait at least 180 days to give them a chance to investigate, so 6 months, and then you can pull the charge and bring a lawsuit.
And then if they rule against you, can you still bring a lawsuit?
You can, absolutely.
Which is the hardest class to prove discrimination for?
That's a good question. I'll tell you the easiest class first is retaliation for complaining about discrimination. That's the most successful. Statistically, it may be the case that I haven't tried. I have a transgender client who we almost went to trial for, and I was nervous about how a jury in a somewhat conservative county would rule in her, whether or not they would rule in her favor. I was going to say, I think that that's the category of person that's the hardest to relate to for most people.
Which were your biggest cases with the biggest settlements? What were some of those stories?
Of course, the best ones are the ones I can't talk about, right? Really ugly sexual harassment cases where there's a criminal conviction for sex assault. High-level executives who had really good evidence of discrimination. Sometimes when you get at that really high levels, people are so arrogant that they don't censor themselves the way that they should. So those have been some good settlements. I've had some really big verdicts for race discrimination and for sexual harassment as well.
When the thing that wasn't censored, what did they say?
In one of the settlements,
Mm-hmm.
they just said they wanted to have sex with the person.
It's
pretty straightforward.
came right out, huh?
Some of these people that have gotten away with it for years are really, really arrogant. And I think that psychologists don't use the word sociopath anymore, but they really are. I have a good story for you. We'll edit this previous stuff out, I hope. But one of my clients had a case where the boss was sending her nude photos of himself in the shower with an erect penis. And he thought that she was too stupid to back the pictures up, that she wouldn't know how to save them. And he told her to delete them, and she said she had. And so those were great evidence. I loved attaching those to my position statement.
Is that unbelievable that you would be that stupid?
It's stupid or arrogant, or both. He wasn't stupid. He was just really, really arrogant.
Like, what do you think?
But keep in mind what you said, Michelle, which is that people don't report this. So he's gotten away with this for years. And nobody called him on it. But it just takes one.
Yes. And then women will think, well, what did I do? Did I do something to provoke? Did I do something that opened it? There's that whole self-talk of, oh, it must be somehow my fault. And, we take the fall or the blame and feel shame whenever it's just not the case.
And the good manipulators use that. They know that. They know that we're trained that way. And that, so they'll say, well, it's kind of your fault. You made me do it. It's because you're so beautiful. I can't help myself.
I can't contain it. So, and then we had all these things that they would go after them. And the victim blaming is enough to make a lot of people think twice about achieving any sort of equity in it. But what was it, that other defense you said, that they would do the nuts and sluts thing?
They still do the nuts and sluts thing. That's why I like to have bigger cases, because you could have a couple, one woman, she can be a nut or a slut. Two women, probably not both of them nuts and sluts, but maybe three or more, they're not likely to all be nuts and sluts.
So that's if they use that as a reason why the whole thing is not justified. But can you sexually harass someone who, it doesn't matter if they're a nut or a slut, does it?
It goes to credibility, because sexual harassment doesn't usually occur, at least the most severe, in front of other people. So usually it's a he said, she said. And the fact that she said this happened is evidence. So you try to cut down her or reduce her credibility. That's the way that these cases are defended.
What about old people?
And that can be brutal.
Yeah, we talked about that in my last book, the difficulties with aging, because companies will go to extraordinary means to get people pushed out of their jobs. And some of that was really shocking because of the health care. Can you just give a little summary of some of that?
Age discrimination is the saddest kind of discrimination for me, because you don't have time to fix it and recover your career, but absolutely it happens. And it happens because the older you get and the more senior you get, the more expensive you get, the more expensive your health care is. And so the more incentive the employer has to push you out, unless you're invaluable.
And you had one company that it was a class action suit, right? They systematically went after people who were older because of that.
It's still going on, but what happened is the company had a cash crunch, and they decided that they needed to have some short-term gains for the stock market. And so they got rid of some of their more expensive workers that had high healthcare costs. They were also helping self-insured at the same time. And then the irony is that they lost a lot of really critical skills, and they had to rehire a number of those people.
Short term. decisions right there.
And all of these are cases that when you take them on, there's a degree of right or wrong and personal mission in it. And I asked you about bigger cases, but what are the ones you lost that it really broke your heart?
I lost one to a jury of 3 women that were Somali airport plane cleaners that I shouldn't have lost because it was just a really bad time to be trying that case to a jury. It was right when we were made very afraid of Muslims in the airport, and these were women that were Muslim who covered their heads and were cleaning airplanes. And I should not have lost that case, but the jury was not in the mindset to listen to the evidence fairly.
Mm. Oh, this is so interesting. Michelle, why don't you give us the wrap so we know a little about what our takeaways are here?
Right. Well, thank you so much. I think, one thing is, I think there's a lot of women listening to this who are walking away a lot smarter. I think the reminder around remembering that HR is a great place to go, but remember and keep in perspective that HR is there for the company. So if you find yourself in a situation that is, you feel compromised or something's inappropriate, I think just remembering to recognize that there's a problem. And you mentioned things like if you feel excluded from events or activities, if you are passed over for promotion because someone else who has lesser skills, these are things, if somebody blatantly says something to you, these are things you need to be taking notes, documenting, keeping hard copies of, just in case you need it, and to go and seek legal counsel early, just to understand what your options and what your rights are. It's up to you, right, to decide what's the right action to pursue, but at least you've come from a place of power where you are making the best decision for you. And I think those are just great reminders, because I know this is happening a lot more than what we want to admit. And we need to, again, shift from being the victim to being coming from that, again, place of power where we can make the right decisions for ourselves. So I just thank you so much for helping us walk through these stories, Diane.
That was really insightful. Thank you, Diane.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yes, same here.
Thank you for joining the Hard-Won Wisdom podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.